The ground crew at Pembroke Dock thought they were witnessing an attack. June 23, 1942. Mid-afternoon, the distinctive silhouette of a Focke-Wulf 190 emerged from low cloud cover, circling the Welsh airfield in a landing pattern. Every man who saw it assumed the same thing. This was a strafing run. Any second now, the German fighter would open fire with its devastating cannon armament. But the cannons stayed silent. The landing gear came down, flaps extended, and then, impossibly, the deadliest fighter aircraft in the Luftwaffe's arsenal gently kissed the grass runway and taxied toward the hangars like it owned the place. The pilot who climbed out of that cockpit, Oberleutnant Armin Faber, had just made the most consequential navigation error in aviation history. He thought he'd landed at a friendly base in occupied France. He'd actually delivered Germany's most closely guarded technological secret directly into British hands. What happened next would rewrite the tactical playbook for every Allied fighter pilot in Europe. Because once British and American engineers got inside that aircraft, they discovered something the Luftwaffe never wanted them to know. The FW-190 wasn't invincible. It just seemed that way. The aircraft nobody could beat for 8 brutal months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been carving through Allied formations like a scythe through wheat. Its combat debut in September 1941 shocked the Royal Air Force. British pilots who dominated the skies during the Battle of Britain suddenly found themselves outmatched, outgunned, and dying at rates not seen since the darkest days of 1940. The psychological impact was devastating. Spitfire pilots who'd felt invincible after defeating the Luftwaffe in 1940 now experienced genuine fear when intelligence reports confirmed FW-190s in their sector. Squadron briefings took on a darker tone. Survival advice replaced victory tactics. Wing Commander Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's most decorated pilots, encountered the FW-190 in March 1942. His combat report reads like a horror story. Attacked by unidentified enemy aircraft, vastly superior in speed and roll rate, unable to evade, aircraft destroyed, forced to bail out. Stanford Tuck survived. Many didn't. The numbers told a grim story. Between January and June 1942, RAF Fighter Command lost over 400 aircraft in operations over northern France. German losses were less than half that. Experienced squadron leaders who'd survived years of combat were being shot down on their first encounter with the new German fighter. Pilot Officer Geoffrey Page, who'd already survived being shot down and burned during the Battle of Britain, wrote in his diary after encountering an FW-190, "This is different. The Me-109 was a worthy opponent. The FW-190 feels like fighting something from the future. It does everything better than we do." American pilots preparing to enter the European theater received stark warnings during briefings. "The FW-190 is faster than anything we've got below 20,000 feet. It rolls better than our P-47s. Its firepower will tear your aircraft apart. If you see one, call for help and run." But running wasn't always an option. The FW-190 could chase down almost anything the Allies flew. The frustration reached the highest levels of Allied command. Air Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory demanded answers from his intelligence officers. "How do we beat this aircraft? What are we missing?" Nobody had good answers. You can't develop counter-tactics against an opponent you don't understand. The mystery machine British intelligence was desperate. They needed to understand what made this aircraft so lethal. Fragments from crashed FW-190s provided some clues: a powerful BMW radial engine, heavy cannon armament, wide-track landing gear, but the complete picture remained elusive. How did it turn? What were its altitude limits? Where was it vulnerable? Crashed aircraft told only part of the story. Battle damage destroyed the subtle engineering details that made the difference between good and extraordinary. Intelligence officers examined wreckage with magnifying glasses, trying to understand control linkages from bent metal and shattered components. The Air Ministry offered rewards for any FW-190 brought down intact. Special operations teams were briefed on potential capture missions, dangerous commando raids on French airfields where FW-190s were based. Every option was on the table. The need for intelligence was that desperate. They never expected one to simply land at their doorstep with the engines still warm. Before we go further, I want to hear from you. Have you heard this story before? Are you a WWII aviation enthusiast, or is this history new to you? Drop a comment and let me know what brought you here today. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into aviation history, hit that subscribe button. Content like this takes real research, and your support makes it possible. The wrong runway, Armin Faber wasn't a rookie. At 21, he was already a proven combat pilot with multiple kills. On June 23rd, he was flying escort duty for a bombing mission, routine work for Jagdgeschwader II, one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighter units. The mission itself was unremarkable. Bombers hit their targets near Bristol. German fighters engaged RAF interceptors, standard channel operation. Then came the return flight. Here's where things went catastrophically wrong. During a violent dogfight with Spitfires, Faber pulled a hard reversing turn, a classic FW-190 maneuver that used the aircraft's superior roll rate to escape pursuit. The maneuver worked perfectly. He lost the British fighters in the clouds. He also lost his bearings entirely. Combat does strange things to human perception. High G turns drain blood from the brain. Adrenaline distorts time. Cloud cover eliminates visual references. Faber thought he'd turned east toward France. He'd actually turned north toward Wales. The channel crossing took minutes. At 400 miles per hour, the distance between friendly and enemy territory was measured in heartbeats. Faber's internal compass told him he was heading home. Every instinct confirmed it. The problem with disorientation is that it feels like certainty. When he dropped below the clouds and spotted an airfield, his exhausted mind made a simple assumption: friendly territory. The buildings looked military. The runway was the right size. Nothing about the scene screamed enemy base to a disoriented pilot who'd just survived a dogfight. He committed to landing. Gear down, throttle back. Perfect approach. Smooth touchdown. The kind of landing flight instructors would praise. Textbook technique. Then he looked at the aircraft parked along the flight line. British roundels. Spitfire Mark versus RAF personnel sprinting toward him. Faber's hand shot to the starter. The BMW engine coughed once, then died. RAF ground crew were already surrounding the aircraft, rifles pointed at the cockpit. The realization must have hit him like a freight train. He'd just handed Britain the keys to Germany's secret weapon. Years later, in interviews after the war, Faber would describe that moment as the worst of his life. Worse than being shot at, worse than seeing comrades die, worse than years in a POW camp. That single moment of recognition, understanding what he'd done, haunted him forever. The intelligence bonanza. Within hours, Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas was on the phone with the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. "Get that aircraft here immediately. I want every rivet photographed, every system documented, every flight characteristic tested. This is priority one." The response was immediate and comprehensive. Engineers cleared schedules, test pilots canceled leave, security teams established protocols. This wasn't just another captured aircraft. This was the intelligence breakthrough that could change the war. The FW-190 arrived at Farnborough by rail transport 2 days later, covered in tarps to prevent German reconnaissance from spotting it. British engineers descended on the aircraft like archaeologists examining a newly discovered tomb. What they found was stunning. The BMW 801 radial engine produced significantly more horsepower than the Spitfire Mark V's Merlin, but power was just the beginning. The FW-190's genius lay in its design philosophy. Where the Spitfire emphasized aerodynamic elegance, the German fighter embodied pragmatic brutality. The cockpit was wider, giving the pilot better visibility and room to maneuver. The control layout was logical and efficient. Everything a pilot needed was positioned within easy reach, designed by people who understood combat stress. The gun sight was superior to British designs, offering clearer target acquisition. Every aspect of the aircraft had been optimized for one purpose: killing enemy fighters. Engineers marveled at the engineering details. The electrical system was more robust than British equivalents. The hydraulics were brilliantly designed. Even the ammunition feed systems showed innovative thinking. This wasn't just a good aircraft. This was a masterclass in fighter design. Captain Eric Brown, Britain's legendary test pilot, flew the captured FW-190 extensively. His assessment was sobering. This aircraft does everything easily that the Spitfire does with difficulty. The roll rate is extraordinary. You think about banking left and you're already there. The controls are beautifully harmonized. It's a pilot's airplane in every sense. Brown flew combat aircraft from every nation during his career. His opinion carried weight. When he said the FW-190 was special, people listened. The firepower analysis was equally revelatory. 4 20mm cannons plus machine guns, all mounted close to the center line. A 1-second burst delivered more destructive power than most Allied fighters could generate in 5 seconds of sustained fire. British pilots had been dying because they literally couldn't hurt the FW-190 before it killed them. Test firings demonstrated the devastating effect. Engineers set up target aircraft and filmed the FW-190's weapons hitting them. The footage was shocking. Aluminum structures disintegrated. Engines exploded. What took a Spitfire multiple passes to accomplish, the FW-190 achieved in seconds, finding the weaknesses. But the testing also revealed something crucial: vulnerabilities. Above 22,000 feet, the FW-190's performance collapsed. The BMW radial engine, so powerful at low altitude, struggled in thin air. Pilots reported power loss, overheating, and sluggish controls. Meanwhile, the Spitfire Mark IX, with its supercharged Merlin engine, actually got better at high altitude. This wasn't a minor disadvantage. Above 25,000 feet, the FW-190 became a different aircraft: slower, less responsive, vulnerable. German pilots operating at those altitudes were essentially flying handicapped machines. The dive advantage that let FW-190s escape pursuit came with a deadly catch. At speeds above 400 miles per hour, the control stick became incredibly heavy. German pilots needed both hands and significant strength to pull out of high-speed dives. During that pullout, they were vulnerable, unable to maneuver defensively while fighting their own aircraft. Test pilots documented this extensively. They'd dive the FW-190 to maximum speed, then attempt combat maneuvers during recovery. It was nearly impossible. The aircraft wanted to keep diving. Pulling out required every ounce of strength. Defensive rolling or turning was out of the question. Most importantly, the FW-190 couldn't sustain tight turns as long as Allied fighters. It could outroll anything in the sky, but in a prolonged horizontal turning fight, the lighter Spitfire would eventually gain position. The FW-190's weight was a weapon in some situations and a liability in others. British intelligence compiled this information into tactical bulletins distributed to every fighter squadron. The document was blunt. The FW-190 is superior below 20,000 feet if you fight on its terms. Don't chase it in dives. Don't try to outroll it. Force it into sustained turns. Force it high. Force it to fight your fight, not theirs. Pilots who'd been dying in droves suddenly had a roadmap for survival. The fear didn't disappear, but it became manageable. They understood the opponent now. Understanding breeds confidence. The American advantage. In August 1942, the RAF did something unprecedented. They invited American test pilots to Farnborough to fly the captured FW-190 themselves. The Americans arrived skeptical. They'd heard British assessments before. This time they wanted hands-on experience with the enemy aircraft that would soon be trying to kill them over Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Cass Howe flew the FW-190 for 2 hours, pushing it through every maneuver in the combat playbook. His report back to 8th Air Force Headquarters was detailed and tactical. The FW-190 will dominate any engagement below 20,000 feet. Our P-47 Thunderbolts cannot match its low-altitude performance. However, above 25,000 feet, we have the advantage. The solution is simple. Stay high. Bomber escorts at maximum altitude. Fighter sweeps above 25,000 feet, force German interceptors to climb into our operational envelope. This single piece of intelligence rewrote American fighter doctrine for the entire European campaign. When P-47 units began operations in early 1943, they operated at altitudes that seemed excessive. Pilots complained about the cold, about oxygen system problems, about the difficulty of spotting targets from 30,000 feet. But commanders insisted. The tactical advantage was worth the discomfort. Bomber formations flew at 25,000 feet or higher, with fighter escorts stacked above them at 30,000. When FW-190s rose to attack, they entered an altitude band where their engines gasped and their pilots struggled while American fighters operated at peak efficiency. The tactical transformation was dramatic. German pilots who'd enjoyed months of superiority suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. The aircraft hadn't changed, the tactics had. And tactics, informed by intelligence, trumped hardware. By late 1943, American P-51 Mustangs were engaging FW-190s at high altitude and winning consistently. The kill ratios that had favored Germany so heavily in early 1942 had reversed. Allied fighters were shooting down 2 German aircraft for every loss. Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, credited the intelligence from Faber's aircraft directly. We knew exactly how to fight the 190. Stay high, force them to climb, engage when their engines are struggling. It wasn't magic. It was science. And it saved lives. The design influence. The captured FW-190 influenced more than tactics. It changed how Allied engineers designed fighters. American engineers at Wright Field studied the roll rate advantage obsessively. They modified P-47 and P-51 ailerons, trying to replicate the FW-190's crisp responsiveness. While they never quite matched the German design, the improvements were significant enough that pilots noticed. The gun placement, concentrated near the fuselage center line, influenced American thinking on weapons installation. Future American fighters would adopt similar configurations, understanding that concentrated firepower was more lethal than dispersed weapons. The wide-track landing gear design informed carrier aircraft development. Navy engineers studied how the FW-190's gear geometry provided stability during landings, applying those lessons to carrier-based fighters where landing stability was critical. Even the cockpit layout, with its logical instrument arrangement and excellent visibility, became a reference standard. American cockpit designers visited Farnborough specifically to study the FW-190's ergonomics, taking detailed measurements and photographs. But perhaps the most valuable lesson was psychological. Allied pilots had been intimidated by the FW-190's reputation. They'd heard it was unbeatable. They'd lost friends to it. The fear was genuine and tactically significant. Once they understood the aircraft's limitations, that fear evaporated. The FW-190 was an excellent machine, but it wasn't supernatural. It had weaknesses. It could be beaten. And Allied pilots now knew exactly how to do it. The price of one mistake. Oberleutnant Armin Faber spent the rest of World War II in a Canadian POW camp. He survived the war and returned to Germany, living until 1976. Luftwaffe records show he was initially blamed for the loss, though later assessments acknowledged that combat disorientation could happen to anyone. The real tragedy, from Germany's perspective, was institutional. They'd developed a superior fighter and maintained technological advantage for months. Then they lost it all in a single afternoon because one pilot got turned around over the channel. German intelligence had been trying desperately to capture an intact Spitfire Mark IX for analysis. They ran dangerous ground operations in Britain, attempted airfield raids, even offered rewards to neutral countries, for example, aircraft. The British never had to try any of that. Germany delivered the intelligence windfall wrapped with a bow. Luftwaffe ace Johannes Steinhoff later wrote, "Faber's landing at Pembroke Dock cost us more than 100 aircraft would have. The Allies learned everything about our tactics, our aircraft's capabilities, our vulnerabilities. After that, the air war changed. We were no longer fighting ignorant opponents." The strategic implications rippled through the Luftwaffe. Suddenly, tactics that had worked for months stopped working. Allied fighters started forcing engagements at high altitude. The easy victories dried up. German pilots noticed the change immediately and couldn't understand why Allied tactics had shifted so dramatically. The lesson that echoes today: the Focke-Wulf 190 is celebrated as one of history's great fighter designs. Museums display surviving examples as masterpieces of German engineering. Kurt Tank, the aircraft's designer, is remembered as a genius. But the FW-190's legacy is inseparable from June 23, 1942. The aircraft that could have remained a mysterious, psychologically devastating weapon instead became a teaching tool. Every Allied pilot studied it, trained against it, learned its vulnerabilities. The broader lesson transcends aviation history. Technological superiority matters, but it's fragile. It depends on secrecy, on opponents not understanding your advantages or exploiting your weaknesses. Once that knowledge barrier breaks, the advantage often evaporates quickly. Germany spent enormous resources developing the FW-190. Engineers worked for years perfecting its systems. Test pilots died during development. The Luftwaffe deployed it carefully, protecting its secrets through operational security. All of that effort came undone because one pilot turned the wrong direction during a dogfight. In warfare, intelligence often matters more than hardware. The side that understands what they're facing, its strengths, its limitations, how to counter it, wins, even if the hardware itself is inferior. The Spitfire Mark V was technically inferior to the FW-190 in most respects, but Spitfire pilots who understood how to force the fight into their envelope could win. The fighter that taught the Allies how to win. The captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough throughout the war. As new variants appeared, the FW-190D with its inline engine, the TA-152 high-altitude fighter, Allied engineers compared them to Faber's aircraft, understanding how German designers were evolving the design to address known weaknesses. Every modification told a story. When the FW-190D appeared with a liquid-cooled engine, Allied intelligence immediately understood. The Germans were trying to fix the high-altitude performance problem. That knowledge informed tactics against the new variant before it even entered widespread service. Captain Erich Braun, who flew virtually every captured German aircraft, later said, "If I had to identify the single most important intelligence coup of the air war, it would be Faber's FW-190. That one aircraft taught us more about German fighter design philosophy, tactical thinking, and operational limitations than years of combat experience. It was the Rosetta Stone that let us decode everything that came after." The numbers support that assessment. In the 6 months before Faber's capture, the FW-190 enjoyed a kill ratio approaching 5.1 against Allied fighters. In the 6 months after Allied pilots received tactical bulletins based on the captured aircraft, that ratio dropped to nearly even. By late 1943, Allied fighters were winning decisively. One aircraft, one mistake, one intelligence windfall that changed the trajectory of the air war over Europe. The Focke-Wulf 190 was supposed to be Germany's secret weapon, the aircraft that would maintain air superiority over the Reich. Instead, it became the aircraft that taught the Allies exactly how to win. Not through a brilliant intelligence operation or daring raid, but because one disoriented pilot turned the wrong way over the English Channel. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest errors, and sometimes the most devastating losses come not from attacks, but from simple accidents that hand your enemy everything they've been desperately seeking. That's how a navigation mistake changed World War II. That's how the Allies learned to beat Germany's best fighter, and that's how one wrong turn shifted the balance of power in the skies over Europe forever.